She had also, before the clock struck 9 that Tuesday evening in October of 1871, carried 4 full scuttles of coal from the basement to the upper guest rooms, beaten 2 wool rugs in the rear courtyard until her palms had gone raw, repressed the Irish linen tablecloths that Mrs. Aldgate, the housekeeper, had declared unacceptable after Clara had already pressed them once that morning, polished the silver service until her face appeared in every spoon, and served dinner to a table of 12 men who had not looked at her once, not once in 3 hours. She was a shape in the room, a pair of hands, a presence so unremarkable that the congressman from Virginia had once gestured through her to indicate the butter dish as though she were constructed of air. Clara had learned, in 4 years of domestic service, that invisibility was a form of armor. You did not exist, and therefore you could not be blamed, threatened, dismissed, or handled. You moved through the gilded rooms of Washington's most powerful men like a ghost with a mop, and you went home, or rather, to your narrow bed on the servants' floor, and you read whatever books you had borrowed or quietly salvaged from the household's discarded shelves, and you reminded yourself that you were more than what they saw, or did not see. It was on the return from her last task of the evening, the collection of the candelabras from the east corridor, which had to be carried 2 at a time to the scullery for cleaning, that her body made its decision without consulting her. The candelabra was heavy. The corridor was long. She had eaten half a meal at midday, and nothing since. Clara made it perhaps 12 steps before the floor tilted. She did not cry out. She had long since trained herself out of that reflex. What she did was reach for the wall, miss it, and go down in a slow and somewhat dignified manner, or as dignified as one can manage whilst losing consciousness, directly into the path of the man who had just turned the corner at the corridor's far end. He caught her before she reached the floor. This was the first thing Clara knew when awareness returned to her. She had not hit the ground. She was being held, not gently, not with the uncertain fumbling of a man unaccustomed to physical consequence, but with the firm, deliberate grip of someone who had made decisions about bodies in crisis before and had made them correctly. She opened her eyes. The man holding her was looking down at her with an expression she could not immediately classify. It was not alarm. It was not the embarrassed discomfort she had seen on the faces of employers when a servant became inconveniently human in their presence. It was something more focused than either of those things. He was, she registered slowly, extraordinarily still. Most men in unexpected situations moved too much, reached, adjusted, shifted. This man did not move at all. He simply held her and assessed. "Can you speak?" he said. His voice was low, unhurried. It belonged to a man who expected to be heard the first time. "Yes," Clara said, and was mortified to hear how thin her own voice sounded. "I apologize. I will be... When did you last eat?" The question was so direct and so unexpected that she answered it without thinking. "Midday, sir." Something moved through his eyes, not pity. Pity she would have recognized and resented. This was different. This was the expression of a man confronted with a fact he found unacceptable and was already calculating how to address. "Can you stand?" "I believe so." He allowed her to find her footing, but did not remove his hands until she had done so completely and proven the claim. Then he stepped back one precise pace, not the hasty retreat of a man who wished to establish that nothing had occurred, but the deliberate withdrawal of a man establishing appropriate distance. Clara straightened. She was aware of how she must look. Grey dress, white apron, hair partially escaped from its pins, face undoubtedly the color of old paper. She was also aware, with a discomfort she could not entirely name, that this man was looking at her with the kind of attention she had not received in 4 years of service, perhaps longer. "You are the maid," he said. It was not a question, but it was not dismissive. It was simply an observation being organized. "Yes, sir, Clara Hollis. I am very sorry to have—" "What time did you begin work this morning?" She blinked. 5 o'clock, sir. It is now past 10. He said nothing further about this arithmetic, but she had the sense he found the result significant. "I assure you I am quite recovered," she said. "If you'll allow me to leave the candelabras." "Sir, leave them." His gaze moved from her to the heavy brass objects she had apparently still been attempting to collect, a fact she had not noticed until this moment. "They will be attended to. Go and eat something. Mrs. Aldgate has strict instructions about the evening schedule." "Mrs. Aldgate," he said, with a finality that did not raise in volume by a single degree, "works in my house." Clara went very still. She looked at him properly then for the first time, not as a fixture of the corridor, not as an obstacle between herself and the scullery, but as a man. And what she saw rearranged several assumptions she had made about the evening. He was tall. Not merely tall, but built with the particular density of a man whose body had been subjected to genuine physical extremity and had answered it. Dark hair, slightly silver at the temples, a jaw that suggested architectural planning rather than accident. He was not in uniform. He wore a charcoal coat and dark waistcoat with the ease of a man who did not require decoration to establish his significance. But there was something about the way he stood that no civilian tailor could manufacture. He stood the way men stood when they were accustomed to being the most dangerous presence in any given room. She had heard the name. Of course she had heard the name. Every household in Washington had heard the name. She simply had not associated it with the man who had just caught her before she hit his corridor floor. "General Crane," she said, and was grateful that her voice had stopped trembling. "Go and eat," he said again, and then, as she moved to comply, "Miss Hollis." She turned. "Tomorrow morning," he said, "I will be speaking with Mrs. Aldgate about the staffing schedule." He paused. It was a pause that contained more content than most men's paragraphs. "I would suggest you sleep as long as you are able tonight." Clara looked at him for one moment. This man who ran 2,000 soldiers and dined with senators, and had not, in 3 hours, looked at her once across a dinner table, and found that she had absolutely nothing to say. She went and ate. General Nathaniel Ashford Crane had been, by most accounts, unreachable since the war. This was not a reputation he had cultivated deliberately, though he was aware of it and found it useful. The war had ended 6 years ago, and in those 6 years he had rebuilt himself from a man who had made decisions that cost lives into a man who made decisions that preserved institutions. He sat on 3 federal commissions. He advised the Secretary of War. He had twice declined appointments that would have led, most agreed, to the presidency. He declined them because he did not trust himself to want what the presidency required a man to want. He had seen enough of wanting things badly. His wife, Margaret, had died in 1868 of a fever that moved too quickly for any doctor to intercept. He had been in a different city. He had arrived in time to hold her hand through the final hour, and then he had buried her and returned to work, and spoken of it to no one, and that was the end of that particular chapter as far as Washington was concerned. As far as Washington was concerned, General Crane was a monument. Monuments did not grieve. Monuments did not notice things. Monuments stood in the appropriate locations and reminded people of what mattered. Nathaniel had always found this characterization somewhat more accurate than he preferred. He had noticed things all his life. It was, in fact, the mechanism by which he had survived the war and won his rank and maintained his influence in the decades since. He noticed the things that other people considered beneath notice. He noticed logistics, patterns, the small inefficiencies that became catastrophes if ignored. He noticed when his officers were lying to him and when they were merely frightened, and when those 2 states had begun to overlap. He noticed the way a room shifted when a certain man entered it, and what that shift indicated about alliances no one had yet declared. He noticed, on a Tuesday evening in October of 1871, that the young woman who had collapsed in his corridor had hands that were raw to the point of damage, that she had been on her feet for 17 consecutive hours on insufficient food, and that she had, in the moment of her recovery, looked at him with the kind of careful assessment that very few people, and almost no women of her circumstance, directed at him with that degree of calm. Most people, meeting General Crane unexpectedly, became either obsequious or rigid with nerves. Clara Hollis had done neither. She had oriented herself, established the facts, answered his questions without embellishment, and then, when she realized who he was, adjusted her posture and her tone without losing either her dignity or her composure. She was, he thought, considerably more than what she appeared to be. This was not a romantic thought, it was an observation. Nathaniel Crane's mind organized information before it assigned meaning to it, and at this stage, Clara Hollis was information. He spoke with Mrs. Aldgate the next morning. Mrs. Aldgate was 53 years old, had managed the households of 4 prominent Washington families, and was not accustomed to having her domestic arrangements questioned by the man who employed her. She was, however, significantly less accustomed to General Crane's particular variety of quiet insistence, which operated something like a door being very gently and very permanently closed. "The girl is efficient," she said, with the tone of one making a concession. "I have no complaints about her work." "I'm not inquiring about complaints," Nathaniel said. "I'm inquiring about the schedule. It is the standard schedule for household staff, General. It produced a staff member who collapsed from exhaustion in my corridor last evening." He looked at her steadily. "Revise it." Mrs. Aldgate revised it. Clara, who learned of this only when she arrived for her morning duties and discovered that her coal-carrying responsibilities had been redistributed among the male staff and that she had been assigned a 30-minute midday rest period, said nothing. She completed her work. She kept her expression neutral. But that evening, passing the study door on her way to the upper floor, she paused. The door was ajar. The General was at his desk reading, one hand resting open on the mahogany surface in a posture that struck her as oddly unguarded, as though he had momentarily stopped being conscious of how he appeared. He did not look up. Clara continued to the upper floor. She thought about those hands, wide, scarred along the left knuckle, holding a sheaf of papers with the particular lightness of a man who understood that the force required to hold something was not the same as the force required to control it. She thought about that for longer than was strictly appropriate. And then she read 17 pages of a history of ancient Rome she had borrowed from the lower shelf of the library, a shelf the General apparently never used given the dust, and she went to sleep. Senator Harlan Ford had known Nathaniel Crane since before the war, which meant he had known him when Nathaniel was still a man who could be maneuvered. Those days were unfortunately over, but Ford was a patient man, and he had observed, with the professional acuity of a 30-year political career, that even monuments had their structural vulnerabilities. You simply had to locate them. He had been attempting to locate Nathaniel's for several years. Ford wanted the Mineral Rights Commission appointment, which Nathaniel was blocking on the grounds of a conflict of interest that Ford found tediously inconvenient. He wanted several other things as well. The list was long and the reasons were complex, but the Mineral Rights Commission was the most pressing, and Nathaniel's opposition was the most significant obstacle. Ford was the kind of man who, when direct opposition failed, looked for leverage. He was skilled at looking. He had not expected the leverage to present itself in the form of a maid, but Ford had learned never to underestimate the value of small observations. He had been at the dinner in October, one of 12, none of whom had looked at the serving girl. And he had been present in the corridor 3 days later when he arrived unannounced and witnessed, from a discreet distance, a brief exchange between General Crane and the same girl. It lasted perhaps 2 minutes. Nathaniel asked her something. She answered. He responded. The entire interaction was entirely unremarkable by most measures, but Ford had spent 30 years watching Nathaniel Crane speak to people, and Nathaniel Crane did not look at most people the way he had looked at that girl. Ford made a note of it. It was 3 weeks after the collapse in the corridor that Clara and the General had their first real conversation. She had not sought it. She had, in fact, been actively avoiding any situation that might produce it, on the grounds that whatever had passed in that corridor had been unusual enough that attempting to repeat it seemed inadvisable. She did her work. She was efficient. She was invisible. But the library presented a problem because Clara needed it. She had, over the course of 4 years of service, read nearly everything accessible to her: the discarded novels, the outdated newspapers, the agricultural reports that no one had touched in decades. The Ashford Manor Library was, by contrast, extraordinary. 3 walls, floor to ceiling, of everything from Thucydides to the latest congressional records. She had been borrowing from the bottom shelf for 6 weeks. On a Thursday afternoon in November, she came to return 2 volumes and discovered that the General was in the library. He was standing at the far wall back to the door, apparently engaged with something on a high shelf. He turned when he heard her enter, and she stopped. "Miss Hollis," he said with the equanimity of a man who found nothing surprising about this situation. "I beg your pardon, sir. I was returning these." She held up the books, which were, she registered with a specific and unpleasant clarity, Plutarch's Lives and a collection of Federalist papers, neither of which had come from the bottom shelf. Nathaniel looked at them. "Sit down," he said. "Sir, I have duties." "You have a 30-minute rest period," he said. "I believe it begins now." He returned to his own armchair with the quiet certainty of a man who had made a decision and was finished reconsidering it. "Sit down, Miss Hollis." She sat. He looked at the books again. "What did you think of the Plutarch?" Clara opened her mouth and then closed it. This was, in her experience, not a question that was asked of maids. "I thought," she said carefully, "that his treatment of Coriolanus had a great deal to say about the relationship between military excellence and political wisdom, or rather, the failure of those qualities to coexist in a single man." Silence. Nathaniel looked at her with that same focused quality she had first noticed in the corridor, as though he were adjusting a previous calculation. "Go on," he said. It was the most dangerous invitation she had received in 4 years. She went on. For 23 minutes, she counted them from habit. They discussed Plutarch, the Federalists, the nature of Republican governance, and the problem of how men who were excellent at the exercise of power rarely had the temperament to submit to its limitation. Clara was precise and slightly too honest, and occasionally wrong in ways that she recognized mid-sentence and corrected. The general was sparse, pointed, and, she suspected, considerably more interested in the conversation than he indicated. When she rose to leave, she paused. "Why are you doing this?" she asked. She had not planned to ask it. The words arrived before she could determine whether they were wise. Nathaniel looked at her from his chair. The firelight was behind him, and his face was in partial shadow, and she could not read the full register of his expression. "Because you're there," he said, which was either the simplest or the most complicated answer she had ever received, and she did not, for the remainder of that day, determine which. The story that appeared in the Washington Courier on the 14th of December was small. It was, in the architecture of scandal, no more than a footnote, 3 column inches, placed below a story about tariff reform, worded with the delicate viciousness of a writer who had been paid to imply rather than assert. "It has come to this publication's notice," it read, "that General N.A. Crane, whose reputation for austere personal conduct has long been considered above reproach, has of late established an unusual domestic arrangement with a woman employed in his household. The nature of this arrangement has not been officially confirmed, but sources close to the general's circle indicate that the young woman in question has been granted privileges inconsistent with her station, including access to private areas of the residence. Those who have observed the matter suggest that the general's celebrated coldness may be less universal in its application than previously supposed. It did not name her. It did not need to. By the afternoon of the 14th, Clara had been called to Mrs. Aldgate's office and informed, with the careful language of a woman who genuinely appeared to feel something about what she was saying, that the agency had requested her transfer to another household, effective at the end of the week. "I have not done anything improper," Clara said, and kept her voice level. "I know that," Mrs. Aldgate said, and for the first time in Clara's experience, the older woman sounded like a person rather than a function. "I know you haven't, but the appearance is considered sufficient." Mrs. Aldgate said nothing, which was its own answer. Clara returned to her duties and completed them with the same precision she brought to every task, and when the evening came, she sat on her narrow bed in the servants' quarters and held the information of her own dismissal in her hands and examined it from every angle, and determined that she would not cry about it tonight. There would be time to cry later, or perhaps not. Perhaps she would simply carry it the way she carried all the other things, pressed flat between the pages of herself, where they took up space but did not spill. She did not know that the general had already seen the article. She did not know that Nathaniel Crane had read it twice, folded the newspaper, placed it on his desk, Hans sat for 11 minutes in the specific quality of stillness that his officers had over the course of many years learned to recognize as the interval between a decision being made and a decision being executed. She did not know any of this until the following morning, when she arrived to find that Mrs. Aldgate had been given new instructions and that the agency had received a letter written in the General's own hand, which was itself unusual enough to have caused comment at 3 separate addresses, informing them that Miss Clara Hollis was retained in her current position at the General's specific request, and that any further correspondence regarding her employment was to be directed to him personally. She also did not know, until somewhat later, that a second letter had gone out that same morning, this one to the editor of the Washington Courier, that was described by its recipient as the most quietly alarming document he had ever been asked to read, and which resulted in a retraction appearing within 48 hours in a position far more prominent than the original article. What Clara did know was that when she passed the study that morning, the door was open, and the General was at his desk, and he looked up. "I would like to speak with you," he said. "This afternoon, if you're willing." She looked at him for a moment. "I am willing, sir." He nodded once. She continued down the corridor. Her hands, she noted distantly, had stopped being quite as cold as they had been for the last 18 hours. He did not open with an explanation. She had half expected him to, a tactical justification, the laying out of terms, the kind of precise language he used in all other matters. Instead, when she settled into the chair across from his desk that afternoon, he was quiet for a moment, as though completing some internal translation. "I want to be direct with you," he said at last. "I prefer that," Clara said. "What was written in that paper was intended to harm you. The source of it was Senator Ford, whose opposition to my position on the Mineral Rights Commission has made him creative in his methods." He paused. "You became useful to him as a means of reaching me." "I see." She had suspected something like this. She had not suspected she would be told it plainly. "I have addressed it," he said. "The retraction will be published. The agency has been notified. But I want you to understand what occurred, because you deserve to understand the full situation rather than a partial version of it." Clara absorbed this. Outside the study windows, Washington moved in its grey December way. The carriages, the men in tall hats, the scaffolding of a city perpetually rebuilding itself. "Why does Senator Ford believe you would be moved by an attack on a maid?" she asked. The question was direct enough that a man with a thinner skin might have reacted to it. Nathaniel simply met her gaze. "Because he noticed that I look at you differently than I look at most people," he said. The room was very quiet. Clara found that she needed a moment. She took it because she had learned that the unwise thing was to speak before you had determined what truth you were speaking. "Is he correct?" she asked. "Yes," said General Nathaniel Crane. She looked at him. He looked at her. And in that looking there was nothing theatrical, no performance of feeling, no careful management of implication. There were simply two people who had been conducting a very slow and oblique approach toward a set of facts, and had arrived at them. "I am a maid," she said, not as a disclaimer, as a fact requiring acknowledgement. "You are," he said. "And I am a general who has sent men to their deaths and declined 2 presidential appointments, and has not, in 6 years, spoken to anyone the way I spoke to you about Plutarch 3 weeks ago." He paused. "I am not suggesting that these facts cancel each other. I am suggesting that they exist simultaneously, and that I have found the combination. Difficult to navigate by my usual methods." Clara took a slow breath. "What are your usual methods?" she asked. "Avoidance," he said, and the word carried a dry, self-aware weight that was the closest thing to humor she had yet heard from him. She discovered, somewhat to her own surprise, that she wanted to smile. She did not quite, but it was a near thing. "I am not certain what you are asking me," she said carefully. "I am not certain I am asking you anything," he said. "I am telling you things that I believe you are owed the knowledge of. What you do with them is your own matter." He held her gaze steadily. "I will not pressure you. I will not make your employment contingent on anything. I want that stated plainly." "I understand," she said. And she did. She understood the extraordinary care with which this was being said, the deliberate construction of it, the fact that a man of his power had thought carefully about the exact ways in which power could corrupt an exchange like this one, and had tried to dismantle each of them before the conversation began. She was, she found, moved by this. Not swept away, and she was not a woman who swept easily, but moved, the way a carefully built structure is moved by significant weight. It registers, it adjusts, it holds. "I would like to keep speaking with you," she said, "in the library, as we have been." "Yes," he said, "and I would like to have my position in this household remain what it is for the present." "Of course." "And I would like," she said, "for you to understand that what I think about the matter, about you, about any of this, is something I will require time to determine, and that I will not be rushed into a position by either pressure or by gratitude." He looked at her with the expression she was beginning to recognize, that recalibrating quality, the slight shift in his attention that meant she had said something that exceeded his existing model of her. "I would expect nothing less," he said. The retraction appeared on December 16th. It was, by the standards of the Courier, unusually prominent and unusually specific in its apology. Clara read it in the kitchen over her morning tea, and noted that its language was careful in the way that language was careful when someone with significant resources had been very precise about what, exactly, needed to be corrected. She returned to work. Ford, whose sources informed him of the retraction within hours, made the calculation that direct attack had produced unwanted results and adjusted his strategy accordingly. He was, as previously noted, a patient man. He called in a favor from a woman named Mrs. Hargrove, who ran the domestic employment agency through which Clara had been placed, and who owed Ford a significant debt of the financial variety. He instructed Mrs. Hargrove to compile whatever information she possessed regarding Miss Clara Hollis's background. What Mrs. Hargrove found was this: Clara's father, Edmund Hollis, had been a schoolteacher in Baltimore, who had in 1864 been dismissed from his position following accusations of radical sympathies, specifically the charge that he had been corresponding with abolitionist organizations in ways that exceeded what his employers considered appropriate for a man of his position. The charges had been contested and never fully substantiated, but the damage had been sufficient to end his career, and Edmund Hollis had died in 1867, and his daughter had entered domestic service, and this was the entire relevant history. It was not, as scandals went, particularly powerful, but Ford knew how to make things powerful. He began to speak in the careful way of men who understood how Washington actually functioned to the right people. The word radical was placed in proximity to the name Hollis at 3 separate dinner parties. The word inappropriate was applied, with raised eyebrow rather than declaration, to the ongoing situation at Ashford Manor. He waited. Washington was a city that ran on implication. You did not need to complete a sentence. You merely needed to begin it in the right rooms. By the 20th of December, Clara had received 2 pieces of indirect information that, taken together, told her exactly what was happening. A fellow maid at a neighboring household had mentioned, with the uncomfortable kindness of someone delivering bad news they wished they didn't have, that her name was being discussed in circles. A vendor who delivered to Ashford Manor had been asked by someone he couldn't identify to confirm details about her working arrangements. She was being assembled into a weapon. Ford was simply waiting to see how the general responded to the threat. She went to Nathaniel. This was, she knew, itself a choice. She was not required to. She could have waited to see what unfolded, or managed it quietly, or simply accepted that she was a small person in a large game and could not expect to influence its outcome. But she had not, in 24 years, been a woman who waited for circumstances to arrive. She found the general in his study on the evening of the 20th, knocked on the open door and entered. "I need to tell you something," she said. He set down his pen. "Tell me," she told him. All of it. The conversations she'd overheard, the vendor, her father's history, and her own read of what Ford was attempting. She presented it the way she had learned to present everything, in order, without embellishment, with her own analysis clearly labeled as analysis, so he could assess it separately from the facts. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. "You've been watching this carefully," he said. "I watch everything," she said. "It's an occupational habit." Something moved across his face that might, in a man less contained, have been the beginning of a smile. "Your analysis," he said, "is correct. Ford is not attempting to damage you directly. He's attempting to place me in a position where the cost of protecting you becomes publicly embarrassing enough that I abandon the position rather than sustain it." He paused. "He is making a fundamental error." "What error?" she asked. "He believes that my reputation matters to me more than my principles," Nathaniel said. "He has been making that error about me for 15 years. He stood. He was, she noted, not for the first time, but with a different quality of attention than previous times, a man who moved with complete economy. Nothing wasted, nothing performed. "I am going to address this," he said. "I would like to ask you to trust me for a period of perhaps 2 weeks. Can you do that?" She considered him. "What will you be doing in those 2 weeks?" "Gathering," he said simply. Clara looked at him for a long moment, at this monument of a man who had just said "trust me" in a tone that made it sound not like a demand, but like the statement of a terms of trade, a mutual proposition, and made her decision. 2 weeks, she said. What Nathaniel Crane did in those 2 weeks was not dramatic. It was not, in fact, visible at all from the outside, which was precisely the point. He wrote 4 letters. He attended 2 dinners at which he said almost nothing but listened considerably. He had 3 private meetings with men whose names would not appear in any account of subsequent events. He reviewed a set of financial documents that had been obtained, through channels he declined to specify, regarding the mineral rights contracts that formed the core of Ford's interest. He also, on the 8th day of those 2 weeks, sat across from Clara in the library for an hour and a half, and they talked about none of this. They talked about the nature of institutional power, and whether it had the capacity to be genuinely reformed from within, or whether it could only be managed by those willing to remain in permanent strategic opposition to its worst tendencies. Clara, who had spent 4 years invisible in the institutions of power, had opinions about this. Nathaniel, who had spent 30 years operating within those institutions while maintaining a working relationship with his own conscience, had different but not entirely incompatible opinions. They disagreed. They did so with the particular quality of disagreement that existed between people who respected each other's reasoning enough to actually contend with it, rather than simply restating their own positions with more emphasis. At the end of the hour and a half, Nathaniel said, "You would have been formidable in any other century." "I am formidable in this one," Clara said, and there was no bitterness in it. Just the flat statement of a fact she had decided to hold on to, regardless of what the world chose to reflect back. He looked at her with an expression she had never seen on him before and could not immediately name, except that it was warm and it was unguarded, and it lasted only a moment before he recomposed himself, but it had been there. She carried it home to her narrow bed that night and did not know what to do with it and eventually fell asleep. On the 3rd of January, 1872, Senator Harlan Ford attended a reception at the home of Senator Marcus Webb, which was the kind of gathering that shaped the actual governance of the country in ways that no official proceeding could replicate. The room contained 4 senators, 2 federal commissioners, a deputy secretary of state, and, surprisingly, to those who had followed his recent social abstinence, General Nathaniel Crane. Ford arrived at 9. Nathaniel was already there. Ford moved through the pleasantries with the practiced ease of a man who had attended 10,000 of these events and worked his way eventually into Nathaniel's orbit, because that was where the evening's business was located. "Nathaniel," he said, with the warmth of a man who had known another man for decades and had never trusted him. "I wasn't certain you'd be here." "I wanted to be," Nathaniel said. He held a glass he had not drunk from. He was looking at Ford with the specific quality of attention that Ford had always found, even over 30 years, deeply uncomfortable. "I hear you've had some difficulties at the house," Ford said, with the delicate sympathy of a man who had created those difficulties. "I have resolved them," Nathaniel said. Ford smiled. Glad to hear it. These things can become complicated. They can, Nathaniel agreed. Although in this case, I found the situation quite clarifying. He took a small sip of his drink and turned to face Ford more fully. Harlan, I've been doing some reading about the Dunmore Creek mineral surveys from 1869. Ford's smile did not change. The man was too experienced for that, but something behind it did. Have you? He said. Interesting documents, Nathaniel said, particularly the correspondence between the survey contractors and the lobbying group that has been managing the commission appointment process. He paused. I found copies of them quite illuminating. I suspect certain members of the ethics committee would as well. The room had not noticeably shifted around them. The conversations at other clusters continued. But Ford was still, and his stillness was the stillness of a man who had realized mid-gambit that he was not, in fact, the one in control of the board. Those documents, Ford said carefully, would require significant context to— I've provided the context, Nathaniel said, along with the documents, along with a rather detailed account of the methods used in recent weeks to apply personal pressure on a private individual in my household, with the intention of influencing my position on a federal appointment. He met Ford's gaze with the absolute steadiness of a man who had made his decisions and was done with the deliberation phase. I submitted the package to the ethics committee chairman this morning. Ford said nothing. I want to be clear about something, Nathaniel said, and his voice dropped further, quiet enough that it was perceptible only to Ford, which was, somehow, more significant than if he had said it loudly. The woman you chose to use as a mechanism against me is a person of intelligence, dignity, and more worth than you have demonstrated in 30 years of public life. If her name, or her father's name, appears in any further conversation you are attached to, in any context, in any implication, I will consider it a personal matter. He held Ford's gaze for one additional moment. I suspect you understand what that means. Ford understood exactly what it meant. He found a reason to leave the reception early. Clara was in the kitchen when she heard the front door of Ashford Manor close at 11:30, and the measured step she had learned to distinguish from all the other sounds of the household. She had not slept. She had not been able to. She was sitting at the kitchen table with a cold cup of tea and a book she had not read a word of, and when the steps paused outside the kitchen door and then continued on, she rose and followed. She found him in the library. He had not lit the main lamps, only the small lamp on the table beside his chair and the residual glow of the fire, which had burned low but not out. He had removed his coat and was standing at the window looking out at the dark city, and when he heard her enter, he turned. It's done, he said. Tell me, she said. He told her. All of it. The documents, the ethics committee, what had been said to Ford. He told her the way she had told him 2 weeks ago. In order, without embellishment, with his analysis clearly separated from his facts. When he finished, she sat with it for a moment. He'll find a way to minimize it, she said. Men like that always do. He'll minimize some of it, Nathaniel agreed. He won't survive all of it. But more importantly, and I want you to understand this clearly, his ability to make your name useful to him is finished. He has nothing to gain from it now, and significant costs attached to pursuing it. She nodded. He was still looking at her, and the quality of his looking was different from the focused, calculating quality she had grown used to. It was something quieter, something that had put down its professional purpose and was simply present. Clara, he said. No title. Just her name. The situation is no longer complicated by the external factors, he said. The threat is resolved. Your position is secure. I have no further strategic argument to make for any of this. He paused. So I want to say, clearly, with nothing else attached to it, I would like to know you better. As whatever form that takes at whatever pace you determine, with complete freedom on your side to say no to any of it at any time. She looked at him in the firelight. This was the man who had caught her before she hit the ground, who had revised a schedule because she had not eaten, who had spoken to her about Plutarch as though her mind was a thing worth encountering, who had dismantled a political trap while keeping her informed of every step, and who now stood before her without rank or maneuver, just a man making a straightforward request. "I would like that too," she said. He crossed the room. Not quickly. He was not a man who did things quickly, but with that complete economy of movement, covering the distance between them until he was close enough that she had to adjust her gaze upward. And in this proximity he was different from anything she had yet observed. Not smaller, not less, but more human, somehow. The warmth of him was different up close. He had, she discovered, a small scar beside his left eye that she had never been near enough to see before. He lifted one hand, slowly, with the careful deliberateness of a man who was very conscious of his own size and force, and tucked the loose strand of hair that had, as always, escaped her pins, back behind her ear. His fingertips barely grazed her jaw. It was the gentlest thing she had ever seen from a man whose gentleness no one would have predicted. "I was going to say something strategic," he said very quietly. "What stopped you?" "You," he said. "You generally make strategy feel insufficient." This time Clara smiled, fully, the kind of smile she did not produce for strangers or for rooms or for the men she served, the kind that was simply hers, originating somewhere behind the careful competence she presented to the world and arriving unmanaged on her face. He watched it happen with an expression she recognized now as wonder, the specific wonder of a man who has been precise and controlled for a very long time and has encountered something he cannot file correctly. "I should go to bed," she said. "It's past midnight." "Yes," he said. He did not move for a moment longer. Then he did, stepped back that one deliberate pace, returning appropriate distance but not from discomfort, from respect. "Good night, Clara." "Good night, Nathaniel," she said, and used his name because she had decided she was done not using it, and went up to her narrow bed and did not read a single page of anything, and slept better than she had in months. The announcement appeared in the Washington social pages in April, brief, factual, and remarkable enough to be discussed in at least a dozen drawing rooms within 24 hours of publication. General Nathaniel Ashford Crane, the notice indicated, was engaged to be married to Miss Clara Wren Hollis of Baltimore, formerly employed in his household. The reactions were various. Senator Ford, who had by this point resigned from 3 committees under circumstances the public was not fully informed of, said nothing. Mrs. Aldgate, who had quietly become something approaching fond of Clara in the months since December, permitted herself a brief and private expression of satisfaction that she would have vigorously denied if challenged. The men who had sat at 12 dinners without looking at the woman who served them read the announcement in their respective breakfasts and could not, most of them, have produced an accurate description of her if asked. Clara read it on a Tuesday morning in the garden, where she had begun to spend her mornings since the weather had turned, not as a maid, not as staff, but simply as a woman in a garden reading, her hands healed and her posture unstudied, and a cup of tea beside her that she had made for herself and for no one else. Nathaniel appeared in the garden doorway at 9 o'clock, as he sometimes did now, without particular announcement. He had a habit of simply appearing in spaces she occupied, as though proximity had become its own quiet statement. "There are 14 letters on my desk," he said. "Opinions regarding the announcement." "Favorable?" she asked. "Mixed." He sat in the other chair. He had produced a second chair for the garden at some point in February without comment, and accepted the second cup she had already poured. "The majority of them are from people whose opinions I have not consulted about anything in several years, and do not intend to start consulting now." "And the rest?" "2 are from men I respect, who express congratulations." He paused. "One is from my sister in Philadelphia, who says she would have told me to do this 3 months ago if I had asked her." "You should have asked her," Clara said. "I should have," he agreed, without noticeable distress about the retrospective advice. He turned his cup in his hands, that gesture she had learned to read as the closest he came to fidgeting, which meant he was about to say something he had considered carefully and was now delivering. "I want you to know," he said, "that whatever comes next, the attention, the adjustment, the opinions of people who will never matter, I'm not asking you to perform anything or become anything for the sake of anyone's comfort, including mine." He looked at her steadily. "You are enough as you are. You have always been enough as you are. I am simply the man who happened to be standing in the corridor when the rest of the world failed to notice." Clara looked at this man, this general, this monument, this person who had turned out, beneath the rank and the silence and the strategic mind, to contain a quality of attentiveness that was the rarest thing she had ever been offered. She reached across the small garden table and placed her hand over his. He turned his palm upward immediately, without hesitation, and held on. The garden was full of April light. Washington moved beyond the walls in its perpetual reconstruction. Somewhere in the city, the wheels of power turned as they always had. The commissions, the letters, the men in tall hats navigating their careful ambitions, and none of it at this particular moment was the most important thing. "I know," she said. "I know you see me." He held her hand in the April light and said nothing, because nothing was required. He had never needed many words to mean exactly what he meant.